Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my home in Livingston, Montana. Okay, what I'm going to be doing here for the meantime is telling a fly fishing story. Now look, do yourself a favor and shut this video off if you don't like storytelling and you don't like trout fishing or fly fishing, okay? And I'm doing this story, I'm telling this story for a gal in California by the name of Sarah. And why am I doing this? Just to entertain Sarah. And who's Sarah? She knows who she is, and that's all that's important. Okay, now I got to skip a whole bunch of stuff here and get right down to the story, ladies and gentlemen, because this video will be too long if I don't, because I've already stopped and started this camera so many times trying to get this right, it's not even funny. Okay, years ago, I used to live down in southern Idaho. That's where I met my wife. All three of my kids were born in a place called Burley, Idaho. Just Google it. That's in between Pocatello and Twin Falls, Idaho. And that's where I took up fly fishing. That's where I started tying flies for earnest. It was actually my brother that gave me my first couple of fly fishing lessons, believe it or not. I could tie flies before I could actually properly cast a fly rod, okay? But the problem was with living down in Potato Land, living down in Spudville down there, there was no good fly fishing around. You used to have to drive out of Magic Valley and drive somewhere else to get into fly fishing. And that's exactly what my brother and I used to do. My brother and I used to go up to a place called Mackay, Idaho, i.e. Mackay Reservoir, which was 160 miles north of Burley, Idaho, Rupert, Idaho, Declo, Idaho, all those little spud towns, spud farming communities. Why did we go up on that big Lost River? Because that's up above Arco, the town of Mackay, right by, Mount Bora. But we would fish the water that coming into Mackay Reservoir was called the Big Lost River. Just Google it. Because after runoff, the fishing was real good with bait, spinners, flies. Especially the lower that water got, the better it got for fly fishing, okay? All right, this story took place in 1980, I don't know, ladies and gentlemen, 86, 88, 87, I can't remember. But I just know that it had to have been, like around the 1st of August or something like that, because I can remember those water conditions and everything. And we used to fish that quite often. We go up there a couple times every summer. I lived down in southern Idaho for 16 years. So I fished that place every chance I got because the fishing was just that good. Okay, Nick and I, we get all excited this one in particular summer, whatever year it was. We get a bunch of camping gear together because we used to like to stay up there at least overnight because it was a 160-mile drive, you know what I mean? So that we could get more fishing time in. So we take off real early this one particular morning, go roaring up there. It took like three and a half hours to drive up to the Big Lost River, pitched our camp and, drug out our fishing stuff and went fishing, okay? That's the scene. That's the start out here. Okay, we start fishing that Big Lost. And on that particular day, that water was low and it was crystal clear. I mean crystal clear. You could see right to the bottom. That's the time when you get water like that, and it's not flowing very fast and everything, that's when them fish get real spooky. Okay, I'm fishing in and down and below where my brother's fishing. I could see him, to my right, upstream. He was like, I don't know, like 50 yards from me. And, and I'm fishing this big old deep hole down below him because that river, it changed concourses many different ways, shapes, form. It's real sandy around there, real mossy in places. A lot of log piles and brush and all that sort of stuff. But I'm fishing this deep old hole, and I'm not doing too awful good, I'm fishing along there. And I took particular notice of the fact that my brother was keyed into something. Because my brother doesn't have the patience, even though he started me in on fly fishing and gave me my first couple of fly fishing lessons when I got out of service. He did, fishing is one of those kind of things that if he doesn't start catching fish right straight away, he just doesn't have as much patience as I do. And I love my brother dearly, but if he was sitting right here, he'd tell you the same thing. But he was locked into something. I could tell. He many times he was casting, and he stayed up there for quite a while, up at this one particular hole. You know, I'm talking about like, you know, a couple of hours. And so it got kind of towards the afternoon, you know, kind of towards dinner time. And old Nick, he wandered down to where I was at, and I gathered up my gear, and over to camp we went and everything. And old Nick was telling me, he said, boy, Jim, he says, there's this big trout. He said, did you see me fishing that hole up there? And I said, yeah. What was going on up there? I was getting ready to go up there and, you know, talk to you. And he goes, I tell you what, he says, there's this great big old trout in there. And he says, I tried everything that I could think of, and I couldn't get that trout to sucker. And my brother, he should have never done this, but he looked at me right in the eye and he says, Jim, he said, because he knew how I was. He says, that's a fish that can't be caught. Should have never said that to me. And so we get back to camp and get dinner going, and we kept talking about this fish. And I looked at old Nick, you know, and back in them days, I'm a beer drinker, you know, and I had me a couple of beers, and I get all tough and brave and everything. And my brother's religious, you know, so he don't drink or none of that kind of stuff. I told him, I said, tell you what there, Nick. I said, tomorrow morning, I says, I'm going to jump up and go after that trout if it's still in that hole. You know, because he told me all about it. I'm going to go after that trout. And Nick says, well, good luck to you. He says, you're not going to catch that fish. I guarantee you. That fish is so spooky and blah, 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 and all this other stuff. And I said, tell you what, Nick, tell you what. My brother used to like to drink pop, you know, Cokes or whatever have you. I said, tell you what, if I'm able to catch that fish, you owe me a 6-pack of beer. And if I can't catch that fish, I'll buy you a 6-pack of whatever kind of pop you want. And my brother says, okay, that's a deal, but good luck to you. And I could tell by the way my brother was acting and everything that he knew I didn't have a ghost prayer of a chance in hell in catching that trout. Hang on, this gets pretty good. So bright and early the next morning, after I had me a little breakfast and coffee, I head out with my trusty old fly rod. And back in those days, I considered myself a novice fly fisherman. I'd been fly fishing for a few years, but you know, you got to have some years behind you to consider yourself an expert fly fisherman, let me tell you. In my case, I'm 67 years old. I'm an expert fly fisherman, and I'm also a master fly tyer, but not back in them days. So I set out for that hole. I don't pay attention to nothing else. I just go right directly to that hole. And I had to go across a little part of the stream because there was an island in the middle of the Big Lost, you know, the Big Lost River. You know, it wasn't really a real deep river. It wasn't running real fast or nothing like that. But there was a little island, and I carefully waded across this one section of water so I could put myself right on the ass end of that island, down in and below this hole where this big trout is hiding, see? And all it was there was just a big pile of brush, and the water come kind of around the brush like this and washed into the hole. Anyway, I low crawled. I used the army tactic and low crawled up there, and there was a lot of sawgrass sticking up. I remember about this high, good concealment, you know, and whatnot. Abby, I don't think there was any cattails, but I know there was a lot of pretty high grass that concealed me anyway, and because I wanted to get a look at this spooky old trout. And I sat there for a good half an hour at least watching that trout, studying its ways. I shouldn't say him, it was a her. And any time a little trout had come into that lie, that's where they call it, where a trout sits and camps and feeds. They call it a trout lie. Some of you people may know that, some of you may not. But anyway, this big old trout, she was a female, by the way. Any trout that came in there, she'd run them out of there. And the days start warming up and everything, and the bugs start coming out, because you got to have that kind of activity going on to be a successful fly fisherman, okay? Well, that's one part of the science. Anyway, she would very select, she was very selectful on the fish that, on the flies that she was sucking in. Selectful, listen, that isn't even a word. She was, she was being very selective, okay? That's what I'm trying to say. Good grief almighty. You know, she wasn't just, she would come up and there would be certain things that would float in there, you know, that she'd come up and just nose and go right back down again. And this hole was probably like about 3 foot deep. I want to say 4 foot deep, crystal clear. I could see her the whole time, you know, so what I did is I backed off, and I backed off a good, you know, I stayed back a good 40, 50 feet away from her, you know, and I started off with like a, you know, 8.5, 9 foot leader, and started going through my flies. You know, I put an Adams on, and I put you know, just whatever, you know, light elk hair caddis, and what had happened, because I approached her from behind and everything, I was very careful of not to spooking her, but I'd make perfect casts, you know, and some of those casts were pretty doggone long, because as the morning wore on, the more spooky she got, and the more careful I had to be. I mean, this whole scene, from beginning to end, ladies and gentlemen, lasted no less than 4 hours. 4 hours of me working on one single trout. 4 to 5 hours, something like that, on the trout that couldn't be caught. So, at first, I really didn't know what she was feeding on, but after careful observation, I spent just as much time observing her and what she was doing than I did casting, because I had to be real careful. I didn't, you know, because I was casting she was laying like this, and I was casting on an angle to get my fly upstream so it wash down to her naturally, you know, because if you put any drag at all on your fly, it didn't look natural, and she wouldn't hit it. Now, come to find out, what the deal was is she was feeding on mayflies, and I didn't have that many mayfly patterns tied. And mayflies are generally tied on 16s, 18s, and number 20 hooks like that, you know. And I'm thinking, oh man, what am I going to do, you know? So what ended up happening, and I casted many, many times over the top of her, many patterns, and she'd just come up, and it was so irritating. She'd come up right up to the fly and just bump the fly with her nose, just bump it. You know, the fly would be like this, and she'd just bump it with her nose and go down. She wouldn't suck it in. You know, you got to have them suck it in so you can hang iron to them. Okay. I sat there after about 3 hours of this nonsense and thinking, what in the hell am I going to do here? Because my brother, his words were starting to ring true. That fish cannot be caught. That the more those words rang in my head, the more determined I was to catch that fish. By the time it was all done and said, my leader, you know, when you got a tippet, a tapered tippet, that's your leader, ladies and gentlemen. It's usually really thick. On the end that you tied onto your fly line, and it tapers down to, say, you know, 2x, 3x, 4x. The bigger the number is, the smaller that diameter is. I had a 16-foot leader by the time it was all done and said, and tapered down to 6x. 6x is only like about 4-pound test, and it's pretty doggone small. I had a compound leader that was 16 feet long. That's what it took to fool this hen, this female trout. But I had no mayfly patterns. And so what I did is I sat right there among the weeds and all that, way in back of her and away from her and everything. Probably wiggled myself back about 60 feet away from her by this time. And I had some light elk hair caddises tied up with olive bodies. They had about the right color of wings on that elk hair, and I knew that those olive bodies was pretty much correct for the mayflies that was flittering around. So what I ended up doing is taking my fingernail clippers that I clip leader with, and I start clipping that fly down. I clipped that fly down so there was only just a couple of pieces of leader, a couple pieces of elk hair sticking up, and, and I removed about as much material as I could, but made sure that fly could still float, because if it sank, she wouldn't grab it, because it didn't look natural. When you're a fly fisherman, especially a dry fly fisherman, things have got to look natural. You can quote me on that. But that's what I did, is I took a light elk hair olive number 16, one of the smaller flies I had at the time, and made it fit the situation. Yeah, you hearing me? I made it fit the situation. And I tie this thing on very carefully and everything, and I take them couple of deep breaths because, man, I've got a long 60-foot cast, and it's got to be right. I can't slap the water. I can't make any mistakes. I've got the area that I had to hit so that fly would wash into her domain, her line, her hole was only an area about 18 inches by 18 inches. Are you hearing me, ladies and gentlemen? So I wind up, like that. And I let her go. Let her go. And that fly hit right within a couple inches one way or the other where I needed it to be. And I slowly stripped that line in. It kept my eye right on that fly. And it washed down and came around this little bend, this little bunch of brush and everything right in front of her. And here she come up. Here she come up real slow like that. You know what she did? She sucked that fly in. You hearing me? Sucked that fly right in. And I'll tell you what, with my left hand right here, I kind of pulled down and set that hook. And that water just completely exploded. She was very, very mad that I pissed her off. Very, very mad. She came out of that water at least 3 feet, if not 4, straight up. And landed on her side, and down the river she went. She didn't mess around staying in that hole. She went tearing down the river. And just down below me, about 30, 40 yards or so, where I'd been fishing the night before, there was this old gentleman fishing down there by the name of Joe Ballard. And why do I know this guy's name? Is because he was a fellow Burley guy. He lived in Burley, Idaho. I knew him. He was, back in them days, I hunted with a bow, and he was an old archer, and I recognized him. And he was up there fishing, but he wasn't affiliated with Nick and I's little camping trip. And I come tearing down through there with this great big rod full of trout, and I said, "Get out of my way, Joe, man, I got a big one on, And boy, old Joe, he about fell over backwards and reeled his stuff up and got out of that hole. And that fish went down in that hole that Joe had been fishing. And I'd been fishing that the evening before, and I knew how many snags and everything is, and I had to work like hell to get that fish out of that hole to make, because I knew I was going to lose her if she went down in that brush pile and got all wrapped up in the twigs and all that kind of stuff. Okay, I get her out of there. And she runs down, and the next obstacle, where the fight actually ended, it was this slough. Slow-moving water, moss about that thick, and that slough was probably about 50, 60 yards long. It was a big old slough. And I go tearing into this slough after her, because that's about all I could do, because she was pulling me around. I sure wasn't pulling her around, because I had a 6X tippet, a very light test leader, and I had to be very careful, And so she pulls me right into this slough. I remember that all too well. On this right hip right here. On both legs, I had a pair of hip waders on. And I was running so fast that this right leg got stuck in the muck. And I ripped that that wader right off of my right leg. It broke where the strap was up here around my belt. It actually come undone. And on my right side, I was wearing a .22 Magnum pistol because there were snakes up in that country. And, of course, that pistol got all wet, and I lost my wader, you know. It got tore clear off of me. I am not kidding you. And there I was, and I went down in the middle of that slough with that all that moss and everything. And by this time, I'm right up to here. I'm right up to my vest and everything in water, fighting this great big old trout, man. And around that slough we went, and finally, I wore down. One of the biggest battles I ever had. That battle on that hen lasted, yeah, it seemed like a half an hour, but I'm sure it wasn't that long. And I finally got her close enough to me where she was all wore down, where I reached down there with my net, which I don't carry a net anymore. I reached down there and I hooked her and I scooped her up, and I went and threw her up on the bank and threw all my wet, soggy self up there with my wet pistol and all this other stuff. And old Joe, he's up the bank from me, old Joe Ballard, and he says, "Well, Jim," he says, "did that make a man out of you?" I said, "Yeah, Joe," you know, because my old heart was going like that. See, that's the way fly fishing will do you once you get into it, you know. But that fish was a 4.5-pound hen, rainbow, the prettiest fish that you ever seen in your life. And I got her. And I wasn't about to do none of this catch and release bullshit. Okay? Anyway, after I gathered all my gear up and tried to straighten myself up the best I could, I was the proudest. A fly fisherman was born that day. Because after that day, I was no longer a novice. I was starting to get good, and I knew it. And I packed that fish all the way back to camp. And my brother was back at camp laying down because he had a headache or whatever have you. Didn't want to mess with the, you know, you'll never catch that fish kind of thing. Anyway, we had a camper up there, or I don't know, we might have had a tent or something. But wherever he was sleeping, I banged on the door or opened up the tent or whatever have you, held up that big fish, and I looked right at my brother and I said, "You owe me a 6-pack of beer." And he goes, "You gotta be kidding me." He raised up and he looked at me, he says, "You got that trout?" And I said, "I did." Took me all morning long to get her. Patience, my friends, patience. That's another thing that it takes to become a good fly fisherman. Okay, that's the end of my story, but that's the battle. That isn't like the safety pin story I told the other day. This one I won. Got her on a number 16 trimmed down olive-colored light elk hair caddis. I wanted to show you a few things before I quit this video. I've been trout fishing for over a half a century. I've been fly fishing for over 40 years. This, ladies and gentlemen, is one of the oldest pieces of fly fishing equipment I have. You never see people carrying these around anymore. This is a willow or a ricker creel. The most fish that I've ever had in this creel is 18 trout. That's fact. This thing is so old that I've had to sew it back together. You can see this sewing on the back right here. The strap fell apart years ago, and it's just been put together with some rope. And this little shoulder harness is made out of Levi material, believe it or not. And this creel is so doggone old, I don't even remember when I bought it. I don't wear it much anymore. It hangs it upstairs, downstairs, but believe you me, it's seen its fair share of days. And I know that the most trout that I ever had in this creel one time is 18. And one other thing I'd like to show you just for the heck of it, sorry I bumped that camera. Here is the oldest fly rod that I own. It's a Walton Powell hexagraph. Walton Powell was a third-generation rod builder out of California. He died way back. He died in the 1990s, but I had him build me this rod. And I can't remember where Walton Powell, what city in California he lived in, but he was a real old guy at the time. This is called the Walton Powell hexagraph. I don't know if you can read that inscription on there. You probably can't. I've got videos on this rod right here. I've had people try to buy this from me. What it is it's a hexagraph. It's a 6-sided rod. It's got graphite on the outside. It's not a true bamboo rod, ladies and gentlemen. It looks like a bamboo rod, but it's not. It's got graphite on the outside, and it's got fiberglass filler on the inside. This is a collector's item. If you ever get a hold of a Walton Powell hexagraph, you better snarpen it up, because like I say, it's a collector's item. This is my oldest fly rod, and that creel right there is a very old piece of fishing equipment that I own. Okay, Sarah, sweetheart, I hope you enjoyed this story. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all I've got to say. I do encourage you folks that care at all to try to take up the sport of fly fishing. That story I just got done telling you is the truth. I did win. I've won against a lot of big trout, and I've lost a lot. And I've got a lot of stories to tell, too. Okay, thank you very much for watching this video. And take care of yourselves, because nobody else will. We'll see you on down the trail.